The battle is already over. The dying is not. You are standing on a field in northern France, late autumn, and the ground beneath your boots is not ground anymore. It is churned organ. It is mud braided with blood that has turned the color of rust in the hours since the last charge broke and the last trumpet call faded into gray sky. The air smells of copper and open bowel and something sweeter underneath, something you recognize from slaughter-houses, from the skinning sheds behind your lord's estate in summer. The horses smell it too. The ones still living shift and stamp and refuse to step forward, and you do not blame them because you also want to go back, and there is nowhere back to go. You survived the fighting. That was the easy part. The field still holds perhaps 200 men who are not yet dead. They are the ones making noise. Some call for water. Some call for their mothers in languages you do not speak. One man close to your left boot is making a sound that is not language at all. A sound that comes from some place below, thought below fear. Just sound, pure and terrible and continuous. You do not look down at him for long. You cannot afford that attention. Your task now has nothing to do with the mercy he is asking for, and everything to do with the armor he is wearing, which is good plate, Milanese by the look of the finish, and which will bring coin in any market town between here and Paris. This is what actually happens after a medieval battle. Not ceremony, not the clean tallying of victory, not the graceful withdrawal of armies who have done their work and return to warm halls. So what happens is this: the field must be processed. The dead must be stripped before their bodies swell and make armor difficult to remove. The wounded must be sorted into those worth the cost of treatment and those who must be passed. The prisoners must be identified, catalogued, and invested in. The clergy must be satisfied. The villagers must be compelled. The disease must be outrun. The season must be beaten before it turns and traps you somewhere between a battlefield and a home that has been running without you for weeks. You are a mounted man-at-arms. You fought yesterday behind your lord's banner, and you did not die, and that fact does not feel like victory yet. It feels like the beginning of a different kind of work, heavier than swinging steel, longer than any charge, and far less likely to end cleanly. The banner overhead snaps in the wet wind. The morning has brought rain, thin and persistent, the kind that does not fall so much as fill the air. Your gambeson is soaked through already. Your boots have found a seam of mud that reaches your ankle when you step wrong, which you step wrong every third step, because the field is a ruin of hoof prints and boot prints and the shallow impressions left by men who fell and rolled and crawled and stopped crawling. You plant your footing and look across what remains. To your left, a line of prisoners sits under guard, 7 men in varying degrees of armor, their hands bound with cord, their faces showing various things. 2 show nothing, which is the face of men who have done this before and understand the protocol. 1 shows fear, the open-eyed sliding kind, which marks him as newer to all of this. 1 bleeds from his ear in a thin, dark line and stares at the middle distance with the concentration of a man counting numbers in his head, or possibly counting nothing at all. They are worth money. Every one of them is an investment that began the moment your lord's knights accepted their surrender rather than cutting them down. Surrender in this system is not mercy given, it is value recognized. These men are now financial instruments, and they will be treated accordingly. To your right, a priest kneels in the mud beside a corpse, whispering. His robe has collected so much filth at the hem that the brown and the black have merged into a single tone. He is performing last rites, or something close to them, adapted for the scale of what surrounds him. Because he cannot do full rites for every body on this field, and everyone present understands that the gesture is liturgical shorthand, a blessing applied broadly, like paint applied with a mop rather than a brush. He does not look up at you. You do not greet him. You have work to do, and so does he, and neither of you is confused about what this field requires. The Milanese plate, you kneel. The man wearing it is not dead. You register this when his hand moves, just the fingers, a slow reach toward something that is not there. His eyes are open and they track you when you lean over him, and there is understanding in them, which is worse than absence would be. He knows what you are doing. He has likely done it himself or watched it done, and the recognition between you is not human warmth. It is the recognition of two men who understand the same system from inside it. You work the buckles at his shoulder. The leather is soaked and has shrunk slightly in the cold and wet, and it takes longer than it should, and the whole time his fingers open and close at his side. His breathing is shallow, his leg is wrong, bent at an angle below the knee that tells you the bone is through the skin somewhere, even if you cannot see it through the greave. You work the gorget free first, because it is the piece that will bring the best return on its own if the full harness cannot be completed, and because removing it helps him breathe, which is a small mercy you grant without deciding to grant it. He says something. Not to you. Upward at the grey sky in a dialect from further south, and you do not speak that dialect, but the sound of it is prayer, the rhythm is unmistakable, and you keep working the straps because prayer is his business and the armor is yours, and neither task interferes with the other. Behind you, the encampment is waking into its second day. Smoke from cook fires rises and bends immediately in the damp wind. Horses are being led to water at a creek 200 yards east, the same creek that has run faintly pink since yesterday afternoon, and which nobody is drinking from if they can help it. The smell of the fires is food and charred wood, and underneath it always the field, which the wind carries in every direction without preference. Your Lord Steward arrived before first light. You saw him ride in, a compact man on a compact grey horse, wrapped in a riding cloak that told you he had not slept. Well, he carried a leather satchel across his saddle, and he spoke first to the men guarding the prisoners, and then to the sergeant-at-arms who had organized the night watch, and then he sent a boy to fetch you specifically, because you had personally assisted in the capture of a knight who was, by the steward's early reckoning, worth a substantial sum. You finished the Milanese plate and carried the pieces to the collection point, and then went to find the steward. He was writing at a small folding table inside the command tent, the pen moving quickly, his left hand pressing the vellum flat against the moisture in the air that made it want to curl. He did not look up when you entered. He asked you your name, your lord's name, the circumstances of the capture, and what other men had been present to witness it. He wrote all of this down. He asked about wounds on the captive. You told him about the cut across the man's ribs, and the steward wrote that down too, made a small note beside it. He asked if you had seen the captive's heraldry before the battle. You had. A quartered field, blue and gold. The steward recognized it and said a name, the family name of the man you had helped capture, and he said it the way men say numbers when they are satisfied with them. He looked up then. He told you that the knight would require a surgeon's attention before transport, and that you would be responsible for ensuring he did not die in the next 48 hours. He said this without any particular feeling about it, the way he might assign you to tend a horse that had a stone in its hoof. The knight was cargo now, valuable cargo, and you were the man assigned to its care. You went back out into the rain. The surgeon arrived mid-morning, a Flemish man of middle age who had served 3 campaigns and who moved through the wounded with the efficiency of someone who had stopped finding the work remarkable. He carried a wooden chest that opened to reveal iron instruments, needles threaded with waxed linen, dried herbs in cloth packets, a small ceramic pot of honey used to pack wounds, and a short-handled saw that he wiped clean between patients with a rag that had turned entirely brown. He worked on the night in the prisoner enclosure, 2 guards standing over him with their hands on their swords in case the captive decided that escape was worth the attempt, which it was not, because the man could barely lift his head. The wound across his ribs had gone deeper than it first appeared. Though the surgeon cleaned it with wine, which made the knight's hands grip the ground, and then packed it with honey-soaked linen, and then bound it with strips of linen over that. He said the wound would either close cleanly or it would not, and that there was limited additional intervention available to him, and he said this to you as if you were the family physician and he was offering a second opinion. He charged for his services in coin taken from the field collection, which the steward would account for as an operating expense against the anticipated ransom. Everything on this field was an accounting transaction. The dead continued to be processed around you throughout that morning. Stripping a battlefield of its useful material is not, in the late medieval world, considered dishonorable work. It is expected. It is organized. High men move through the dead in rough lines, working in pairs, one to turn and hold, one to remove. Boots come first because boots are universally useful. Then any blade or tool. Then cloth that is not too badly damaged. Armor comes last and requires skill, because armor worn and not removed correctly can be damaged, which reduces its value. The men who do this work know how to do it, have done it before, and will do it again. The ones who do it quickly are the ones who do not think about the faces. You learned this on your second campaign. On your first campaign, you were slower because you kept looking at the faces, which told you things about the men that were not useful information, and which accumulated in a way that required deliberate unloading before sleep. And on your second campaign, you learned to work with the same eyes you use for gutting game, focused on the task, the hand, the object, the buckle, not on the thing above the neck. By midday, the rain had strengthened. The pits were being dug at the field's eastern edge, where the earth was softer, by men from the two nearest villages who had been brought by a mounted sergeant and who worked with the expressions of men who understood exactly what refusal would cost them. They were peasant men, most of them, farmers by hand and posture, wearing the heavy linen and felted wool that marked the lower rural order. They dug without speaking much. The youngest among them, a boy perhaps 14, kept stopping to lean on his spade and stare at nothing. Now, an older man, who was probably his father, would touch his shoulder briefly, and the boy would start digging again. The pits were not deep enough. This is always the compromise. To dig a grave deep enough to prevent smell and animal intrusion requires significant time and labor. Time is not available in sufficient quantity. The decision is made at the level of the sergeant. 2 feet, 2.5 if the soil allows, enough to cover completely and heap with additional earth. Bodies will be wrapped in whatever cloth can be spared, which is not much. Personal effects that cannot be identified or returned will be buried with them. The priest will say words over the filled pits in groups, covering multiple burials with a single prayer, which is theologically irregular, but practically necessary, and understood by everyone to be the best available option under the circumstances. The smell of the field has changed since morning. When you arrived at first light, it was the sharp metallic smell of fresh blood mixed with the opened body smell that is immediate and intense. Now it has begun to shift towards something older and deeper, the beginning of decomposition that happens even in cold weather, just more slowly. The same process but stretched out, giving you slightly more time to complete the work before the field becomes untenable. The flies have found the bodies despite the cold and rain. Autumn flies, slow and purposeful, moving with the heavy deliberation of insects that know what they are doing. The wounded who cannot be moved and cannot survive are the hardest part. Not practically. Practically, they are managed. A man who is drowning in his own lung blood will not survive the transport back to the fortified town, and mercy requires a decision, and the decision is made by the sergeant, or sometimes by a man who is close to the dying man, and the method is quick and quiet, and not recorded, and not formally sanctioned, and entirely understood by everyone as necessary. This is one of those things the system contains without acknowledging directly. The rules say you do not kill prisoners. The rules say last rites should be offered to the dying. The rules do not say explicitly what you do when last rites cannot help a man who will take 2 more days to die in the cold mud, and who is in screaming pain that has stopped being screaming, and become a low, constant moan that sounds like something mechanical. The rules leave a space there, The space is filled by men who have to live inside the field afterward, and they fill it as quietly as possible and move on. You are guarding the night when a rider arrives from the east, moving fast, a courier by the lightness of his gear and the directness of his path through the encampment's mud. He goes directly to the command tent. Within the hour, word moves through the camp in the way that word always moves through camps, from the command tent to the senior men-at-arms, from them to the sergeants, from them outward through the ordinary soldiers, each retelling slightly more uncertain than the last, but the core facts holding. A portion of the defeated force, perhaps 60 men, has been reported by local scouts reforming in a village 3 miles northwest. Not large enough for a second engagement, large enough to be a threat to stragglers, to supply lines, to small detachments moving through the countryside. The mood of the encampment shifts. It shifts in the body before it shifts in speech. You notice it in how men who are sitting now stand. How the horses tethered to the picket line are suddenly objects of attention. How the guards around the prisoner enclosure tighten their formation by half a step. The battle is over. The threat, apparently, is not. You remain with the knight. He is conscious now, propped against a cartwheel wrapped in a horse blanket, his breathing careful and shallow, his eyes moving over the camp with the focused attention of a man who is counting exits and resources and possibilities. He does not speak to you, and you do not speak to him. This is not unfriendly. This is professional. You are his investment, and he is your cargo, and you both understand the terms. He is perhaps 40, the kind of 40 that outdoor military life produces, which looks older than 40 from some angles and younger from others, weathered and dense rather than deteriorated. His beard is several days old, which means he came into the campaign without time or inclination to maintain it, which suggests a man moving fast, a man whose campaign season had been active before this particular field. He has done this before. He has probably been on the other side of this arrangement at some point, guarding his own valuable cargo, calculating his own ransom numbers. He understands the system from inside it exactly as you do, and that shared understanding fills the space between you more completely than conversation would. Now the afternoon brings a different visitor. A lord's clerk, not your lord's, a thin young man in an ink-stained robe who serves a magnate from the northern part of the army, arrives with a written list of claims. Claims on specific captives, claims on specific pieces of armor and equipment, claims that dispute the original assignment of prisoners based on arguments about who was closest to the moment of surrender, who had technically struck the blow that brought the man to ground, who had accepted the formal submission. This is a common dispute. The law of arms has rules about it, but the rules require interpretation in specific circumstances, and the interpretations are contested, and the contestations require additional documentation and eventual arbitration before a court of chivalry if they cannot be resolved between parties first. Yet your Lord Steward argues calmly with the clerk for the better part of an hour. You can see them from the prisoner enclosure, the steward seated, the clerk standing, papers being passed and returned. The prisoners can see them too. The prisoners watch this with particular attention. The outcome of the argument will determine who guards them and where they are kept, and who receives the eventual ransom payments. They have a direct financial interest in the outcome, in the inverse direction from yours. The argument concludes without resolution. Further documentation will be required. Names are noted. Witnesses are identified. The clerk leaves. The steward closes his satchel and for a moment sits very still and looks at nothing in particular. And you can see in his posture the weight of an accounting that keeps becoming more complicated without any corresponding improvement in the underlying figures. The sun, invisible all day behind cloud, drops below the horizon by mid-afternoon because the year is late enough that the days are short. The encampment prepares for a second night. Cook fires are rebuilt. The second night on a battlefield is quieter than the first, which was loud with the sounds of the wounded, who are now mostly either dead or removed. The quiet is heavier. It has absorbed the day's work and holds it. You eat bread that has absorbed moisture from the air and is no longer precisely bread, but is still food. You eat it standing near the prisoner enclosure, watching your cargo sleep, watching the other guards rotate. It's watching the watchfires settle into their steady orange burn that does not so much illuminate as emphasize the dark surrounding it. The boy who dug graves today, the 14-year-old with the spade and the staring eyes, passes at some point between the fires and the darkness. He does not look at you. He's going back to wherever the village men are being kept, probably a barn or a stable, probably with less food than you have and less shelter than the prisoners have. Because that is the correct order in this system, and everyone inside the system knows the order without being told. It rains again in the night. You sleep in a tent that is not quite watertight, waking twice to the sound of something moving in the dark outside that turns out to be horses pulling at their tether, and then once to what sounds like shouting from the western perimeter that subsides before anyone needs to respond. In the morning, your gambeson is still wet and will remain wet for several days. There is no good solution to this. Wet wool in cold air is a problem that medieval soldiering accepts as a constant condition, one of the background pressures that sits beneath all the acute ones. The morning of the second day brings the steward back to the prisoner enclosure with additional paper and the information that transport of the high-value captives to a fortified town 12 miles south will begin tomorrow, conditions permitting. The wounded who cannot make the transport will remain in the camp under reduced guard. The men who are being left to guard them have the faces of men who know they have drawn the short lot. Because remaining in a degraded battlefield camp with declining provisions and increasing disease risk is nobody's preference. You are assigned to the transport party. You will ride beside the cart containing the knight. You will be responsible for his condition on arrival. If he arrives dead, the financial consequence will be discussed with your Lord Steward and will not be pleasant, though not explicitly punitive, because the risk of death in transport is understood to be real and not always preventable. If he arrives healthy enough to negotiate ransom terms, you will receive a portion of the outcome commensurate with your role in his capture and guarding. The portion will be a small percentage of a large number, which in practice means it will be meaningful to your household's winter accounts, but not transformative. Don't you check his wound in the morning? The binding has held. There is no red streaking from the wound edges, which is what you fear most, which is what the surgeon told you to watch for. His breathing is easier than yesterday. He takes water when you offer it, and the way he takes it, the controlled sip rather than the desperate grab, tells you he is stronger than yesterday. This is a good morning. 12 miles south, there is a town with stone walls and a garrison, and a hall where nobles can be kept in conditions appropriate to their station, while ransom negotiations proceed by letter, the letters carried by couriers between this location and the captives' family lands, which are in a different part of France entirely, and the process will take months. This is known and expected. The captive's family will begin gathering the ransom amount, which will be a negotiated figure based on the captive's rank and lands and capacity to pay, assessed honestly because both sides have an interest in a realistic number that will actually be paid rather than an inflated number that will be disputed or forfeited. The system has rules about this too. The rules exist because both captors and captives have been inside the system long enough to understand that the rules serve everyone's interests better than their absence would. The morning of departure is organized chaos. Carts that have been sitting in mud for 2 days must be freed from the mud first. Horses that have been on campaign fodder for weeks are thin and unwilling. The weather is dry for the first time, which is a minor mercy, but the ground has absorbed so much rain that it moves under wheels and hooves like something alive. So you help load the knight into the cart. He's in pain doing it. He does not make sounds about the pain, which is the etiquette of his class and his experience. You arrange the horse blanket around him. The cart has straw in the bed, which is not comfortable, but is better than nothing. The driver is a boy of perhaps 16, not the grave-digging boy, a different boy, camp-born and horse-knowledgeable and utterly indifferent to the cargo he is carrying, except as a navigation problem. The convoy moves out, 6 carts, 2 wagons, perhaps 40 mounted men in varying states of repair, and the prisoners, some walking under guard, the high-value ones riding in carts. The road is a track, technically, a worn path that becomes less distinguishable from the surrounding ground every 100 yards or so, and in the convoy's speed is the speed of the slowest cart, which is very slow. Behind you, the encampment settles into its reduced form, the men left behind watching the departure with the expression of men watching something they would prefer to be part of, moving into the middle distance and then out of sight as the track curves south through hedged fields that show the damage of an army's passage. Broken gates, churned verges, a collapsed section of low stone wall where cavalry went through without bothering to find the gap. The fields on either side of the track tell their own story. This is agricultural land, strip-farmed, the long, narrow plots separated by grass balks, and the harvest is partly done and partly not done and partly done wrong. You can see it from the road, on the wheat that was cut and stooked but not properly dried before the rains, the sheaves sitting now in collapsing rows that will yield flour, that will taste of mold, and will not keep through winter without loss. You can see the plots that were simply not harvested, either abandoned or the labor that would have harvested them pulled away by the army's passage, the grain standing and soaking and already beginning to sprout in the ear where moisture has found it. This is not your land. Your holding is 3 days' ride from here. But the pattern is familiar, because it is the same pattern that your absence has probably created on your own land, your own strips, your own modest provision for winter, which depends on your wife's management and the labor of 2 hired men and your eldest son, who is 12 and competent, but 12. You have been gone since midsummer. You will not be home until the track south connects to the road west, and the road west carries you back to where your life is, which is not here and never quite here, regardless of where the fighting takes you. The convoy stops twice in the first 3 miles. Once for a wheel that finds a rut deep enough to threaten the axle. Once because 2 of the walking prisoners claim their bindings are cutting off circulation, which the sergeant investigates skeptically and then partially addresses, because a prisoner who loses a hand to gangrene is worth less than a prisoner who does not. This is medical attention as financial calculation. Nobody pretends otherwise. At a stream crossing, the horses drink. You water yours and take your own drink from a separate point upstream of where the horses are, which is standard field practice and which your body now performs automatically without conscious decision. The stream is cold and clear here, far enough from the battlefield that the water is not yet touched by what the battlefield has leached into the groundwater, though in a week it probably will be, and the village downstream from the battle site will drink water that has absorbed the biological material of 200 dead men, and the sickness that follows will not be understood to be connected to the battle by anyone except possibly the most observant and empirically minded village elder, who will suspect a connection but not be able to prove it and will not be listened to in any case. The town appears by mid-afternoon, its walls visible first as a line of gray above the tree line, then the tower of the church, and then the gate tower, then the gate itself, heavy timber bound with iron, open and guarded by men in the livery of the garrison. The town has seen armies pass before. The gatekeepers watch the convoy arrive with professional assessment, cataloguing the condition of men and horses and carts, making calculations about billeting and provisioning that will become demands on the town's resources within the hour. The night is transferred from the cart to a hall inside the town walls, not the gatehouse, but a merchant's house whose owner has been displaced for the duration, given modest compensation in exchange for the use of his best chamber. The knight is helped to a pallet. A local woman is found to assist with his wound. She is not a surgeon, but she is competent with wounds in the way that women who have tended households and injuries for decades are competent, which is often more practically useful than formal surgical training, because she knows what is available locally and how to use it, and she does not waste time on interventions that require materials not present. She unwraps the field dressing, examines the wound, makes sounds that are not alarming, rewraps with fresh linen and a different poultice, gives instructions in rapid local French that you follow imperfectly and write down in abbreviated form to pass to the steward. The knight watches her work with the same focused attention he gave the camp, assessing. He asks her something. She answers briefly. He nods once. You do not understand what was exchanged, but the interaction has a quality of professional communication that briefly makes him seem less like cargo and more like a person, which is a perception you file away and do not dwell on. Your Lord Steward is already in the town. He arrived 2 hours before the convoy, riding fast because he had business here before you arrived, securing the accommodation, establishing the formal custody of the prisoners with the town's garrison commander, beginning the first round of correspondence with the captive families. He is seated at a table in the garrison hall with a cup of wine he has not drunk, and a ledger open in front of him, and the expression of a man running numbers that do not yet add correctly. He tells you the ransom negotiation for your captive will open at a figure he names, which is substantial and will likely settle lower after the customary exchange of letters, assessments, and counter-offers. The process will take a minimum of 3 months, possibly 6. You will receive your portion upon settlement, not before, because the money does not exist until it arrives. Until it arrives, the household expenses of guarding and maintaining the captive are costs that sit on the ledger as negative numbers. He also tells you that 2 of the lesser prisoners, the ones who had been sorted as valuable enough to bring, but who turned out upon closer identification to be men of modest means rather than significant rank, will likely not produce ransoms worth the cost of maintaining them. He is considering releasing them on parole, which means extracting a sworn promise to pay a reduced sum and then sending them home to gather it. Parole is the system's compromise between the expense of long imprisonment and the total loss of releasing a prisoner without any return. It functions because the oath is considered binding in a theological sense that still carries social weight in this period, and because a man who breaks parole damages his own standing in a military community that is not large and has a long memory. You ask about your portion in the parole cases. He looks at you with the expression of a man who has answered this question many times and finds it tiring. He says your portion in parole outcomes will be smaller but earlier, which, depending on how winter goes, may be the better outcome. He says this without warmth and without coldness. Informationally. Outside the steward's hall, the town is absorbing the army's overflow. Men who cannot be billeted inside the walls are camped in the fields outside the southern gate. Fires burn. The town's market has already adjusted its prices upward in response to the sudden increase in buyers, which is a mechanism as automatic as weather, the town's merchants knowing from experience that soldiers with recent victory and partial plunder in hand will spend more freely than their actual means warrant, adjusting accordingly. You find a billet in a stable loft. The stable has 4 horses in it, 2 belonging to the town garrison and 2 belonging to senior members of your lord's party, and the heat of the horses rises into the loft and makes it the warmest sleeping place available to a man of your rank. The straw is old, but dry, and you sleep 9 hours and wake stiff and slightly feverish, which you note with the particular attention that men on campaign give to their own bodies, monitoring for the signs of the illnesses that move through armies in the aftermath of battles, the way fire moves through dry grass, quickly, laterally, and without preference for rank. The fever is mild. You eat in the morning bread and salted meat and a thick pottage that the garrison cook produces in quantity if not quality. You drink ale rather than water as a precaution. You check the night's wound. The woman has been back twice and the wound is holding. No smell that would indicate serious infection, the edges beginning to attempt closure. You report this to the steward. He makes a note. You spend the 3rd day in the town, doing what men in your situation do. Maintaining equipment, then maintaining the horse, attempting to dry clothing, exchanging information with other soldiers about the state of the prisoners, the state of the roads, the state of the campaign overall. Conversation in military camps has a specific character, factual and lateral, moving between topics without depth, covering logistics and personnel and prospects without ever settling on a single subject long enough to become either philosophical or personal. You learn from a man who fought on the left flank that the reforming force the scouts had spotted has dispersed or retreated further, or both. You learn that the Army's senior commanders are negotiating over winter quarters. You learn that a well-known knight on your own side has died of his wounds, a man known by reputation rather than personal acquaintance, whose death will affect the political balance of the campaign's next phase in ways that the men discussing it can describe but not fully predict. On the fourth day, the army begins to fragment in earnest. This is the natural seasonal process. The campaign has ended in the way campaigns in this era end. Not with a decisive peace treaty or a total victory or an unconditional surrender, but with the approach of winter making sustained military activity impossible and the armies disbanding by mutual understanding into their component parts, each lord returning with his men to his own territory. The mercenary companies dispersing to winter quarters where they will eat through their earnings and recruit for the spring. Of the great magnates retiring to their halls to spend the winter managing estates and writing letters and preparing for the next year. You are given written orders for the journey home. The orders establish your responsibility for the captive until he is formally transferred to a longer-term custody arrangement that your lord is negotiating. The transfer will happen in a fortified town further west that has better facilities for holding nobles of rank. You will accompany the transfer party, which will be a smaller group, 10 men, moving relatively fast, and then you will be released to return to your household. The transfer takes 4 days. The roads are better than the field tracks, Roman roads in sections, maintained by the towns that depend on them, rutted but passable. The captive travels in a covered cart now, better accommodated than his first transport. Given meals that approximate those of a household rather than a field camp, because he is a valuable instrument and instruments are maintained. He does not attempt escape. This is not surprising. A man with a healing wound in unfamiliar country, in the custody of 10 armed men who have a financial interest in his arrival, has no realistic escape option, and a man of his experience understands this clearly. He travels in silence largely, sleeps when the cart's motion permits, occasionally speaks to his guard in formal brief exchanges about water or food or the pace. On the second day of the transfer, he speaks to you directly for the first time. Not about the journey, about the battle. A specific moment in the battle, an action by a mounted man-at-arms on the left wing that was, by his account, decisive in the engagement's outcome. He describes it with the tone of a military professional assessing tactics, no heat in it, no resentment, just evaluation. You listen and offer your own perspective from where you stood in the field, and for perhaps a quarter of an hour, 2 men who were enemies 2 days ago discuss military tactics with the collaborative interest of professionals reviewing a shared problem. This is also part of the system. The chivalric world is a small professional community. Men who fight on opposite sides in one engagement may be allies in the next, or at minimum will move in the same social and professional circles for the rest of their lives. The enmity of battle is contextual and temporary. The professional relationship is permanent and practical. But he speaks to you as he would speak to any competent man-at-arms of approximately his social level who happened to have been on the field. You respond in kind. When the conversation ends, it ends without ceremony, and you return to the road and the slow movement of the cart, and the interaction closes over like water closing over a dropped stone. The transfer is completed without incident. Your captive is handed over to a garrison commander in a walled town whose name you learn and immediately begin forgetting. Papers are signed. Your Lord Steward, who has ridden ahead again, witnesses the transfer and records it. You receive a partial payment against your anticipated share, a small sum in silver that the steward counts out from a locked box with the expression of a man releasing something unwillingly, which is not personal. It is just the character of stewards. You point the horse west. The road home takes 6 days at the pace you travel, which is not fast because the horse has been on campaign fodder for too long and needs careful management on the return, and because your body is in the particular state of accumulated exhaustion that is not acute enough to stop you, but persistent enough to make everything take slightly longer than it should. You sleep at inns when there are inns and in barns when there are not. You eat what is available. The landscape changes as you travel west, the flat northern fields giving way to slightly hillier country, the trees holding more color even as autumn deepens, the villages becoming more familiar in their shape and material. The familiar, regional style of roof and wall that tells you that you are moving back into the world you know. You think about the captive occasionally on the road. Not with sentiment. You think about him as a financial problem that is now someone else's responsibility, which is a kind of relief. You think about the wound and whether it will close cleanly or whether the infection will find it in the coming weeks, and whether the outcome of that biological question will affect the ransom settlement, and whether the settlement will arrive before spring planting requires coin for seed and labor. You think about your wife, which is different from thinking about the captive. Thinking about your wife involves specific knowledge of her capacity and her judgment and her limitations, which are particular and real, as opposed to the abstract calculation of the captive problem. She will have managed. This is not blind confidence, it is assessment. She managed the last 2 campaign absences with losses that were real but not ruinous, and her management is methodical in a way that yours is not. But she was managing with the labor of a full household last time, and this time the hired men have been on shortened terms because the campaign departure was later than planned, and the autumn contracts had already been let to other men. The harvest. You do not know the yield. You have not known it for 6 weeks. This is one of the sustained discomforts of campaign life that is not dramatic and does not resolve into a single defining moment, but simply persists for the duration, the not knowing, the inability to influence from a distance, the dependence on letters that arrive slowly and say less than you need to know because the person writing them knows less than you need to know, being as much inside the situation as you are outside it. The horse needs rest on the 5th day. You spend a longer than intended stop at a village inn, feeding the horse on better grain than it has had in weeks, walking it slowly through the village and back to restore the circulation in legs that have been carrying you for too long without proper recovery. The innkeeper is a woman of 50 who has seen enough soldiers pass through that your arrival produces no reaction beyond the commercial calculation of what you can pay for what she is offering. You pay, you eat, you sleep in a real bed, which is a wooden frame with a straw mattress and a wool blanket, and which feels like an extraordinary luxury because your comparison point is stable lofts and wet ground. On the 6th day, you come over the low rise at the northern end of your village's common land, and you can see the cluster of the village below you, the church tower, the mill, the irregular line of houses along the main track, the fields spreading east and west in their long strips. You look at the fields before you look at your house. The harvest is mostly in. You can see this from the road. The stooped sheaves move to the yards for threshing or already threshed, the fields stripped to stubble that the village animals are grazing on in the communal rotation. There is a section of the east field that has not been completed, a dozen strips that still stand in partial harvest. And from a distance, you cannot tell if this is normal variation or evidence of specific difficulty. You will find out. Your wife meets you at the gate. She looks at you the way she has looked at you, returning from the previous 2 campaigns, which is with the specific expression of someone who has been managing a problem successfully and is now recalibrating for the presence of another factor in the problem. She is not cold, She is focused. She asks about injuries, and you show her none, and she accepts this and begins telling you about the harvest before you have dismounted. The yield is down. The Eastfield strips are the hired men's work, which was incomplete because one of the hired men left in the first week of September for reasons that amounted to a better offer elsewhere, which she managed by redistributing his tasks to your son and to a neighbor who was owed labor and paid labor back in kind. The south field did better than expected. The kitchen garden is intact. The livestock are all present. 2 sheep sold in October to cover an unexpected fee for the mill grinding rights, which had been increased while you were away in a manner that was disputed by the village but not successfully. She stops listing. She looks at you again. She asks about the campaign. You tell her about the battle in the abbreviated way that you tell her about battles, the outcome, your lord's position, your own position, the captives, the expected ransom. You tell her about the knight's wound and the transfer. You tell her about the partial payment and the amount, and she does the arithmetic in her head faster than you would have done it and arrives at the same conclusion you arrived at on the road. The payment covers the mill fee adjustment and the cost of replacing the hired man for next year, but it does not cover the gap between this year's actual yield and the yield you had counted on when planning the winter's provisions. The gap is not catastrophic. You have been here before, in a smaller version, and you will be here again. It requires selling the 2 younger sheep rather than overwintering them, which reduces next year's breeding stock but preserves the feed grain for the horses and the pigs. It requires accepting a shortened supply of stored grain that means relying on market purchase in February and March when prices are highest, which is a cost rather than a catastrophe. You sit down at the table in your hall and your wife puts bread in a pottage in front of you and sits across from you and you eat and talk, and the hall smells of smoke and food, and the particular human smell of a house that has been continuously inhabited by the same people for years. Your son comes in and looks at you with the particular awkwardness of a 12-year-old who wants to be glad and does not know quite how to express it, and you put your hand on his shoulder and ask him about the harvest, and he tells you about it with detail and accuracy that tells you he was actually doing it rather than watching it done. In the morning, you go to the east field. The unfinished strips are worse than they appeared from the road. The wheat has been beaten down by rain and is lying in tangled mats rather than standing, which makes the cutting harder and the drying time longer and the eventual yield lower. Not lost entirely. Perhaps 60% of the grain can be recovered if you work quickly before the next rain and if the weather gives you 3 dry days in a row, which this time of year is not guaranteed. You work it yourself, which you have not done in a long time, or rather, you work it alongside your son and a neighbor and his son, the 4 of you cutting and tying and stoking through a gray, cold morning that produces a wet, cold afternoon that forces you to stop and cover what you have cut with whatever cloth can be found, and wait. The waiting is its own kind of work. You mend fences while you wait. You check the animals. Dee's son, you speak to the village headman about the mill fee dispute and learn that it has been partially resolved through negotiation with the mill owner, reducing but not eliminating the increase, which is the most that was ever realistically achievable and is being accepted as such. You discuss the east field with a neighbor who has a drying frame that can be borrowed, which improves the recovery calculation modestly. You check on your companion from the campaign, the man who took the injury to his leg during the confused night alarm in the camp, the accidental injury in the false mobilization, the bone that did not break cleanly and has been knitting wrong through the autumn. He is in his house, which is 2 houses from yours. The leg is stiff and will not fully extend, and which his wife demonstrates for you with the efficient frankness of someone who has been managing this problem for weeks and wants another person to understand the scope of it. He cannot ride, he cannot plow, he can walk slowly, he can do light work with his hands. This is not survival-level incapacity, he is not dying and he is not helpless, but it removes him from mounted service for the next campaign season at minimum, possibly permanently, which removes his principal income source, which falls on his household in specific and calculable ways. His wife has already spoken to her brother about increased support over winter. Her brother has a mill tenancy and is reasonably placed. This is how the system absorbs its casualties at the household level. The lateral redistribution of support across kin networks, which is neither charity nor entitlement, but a recognized mutual obligation that everyone in the network understands themselves to be both giving and receiving across the span of a lifetime. It functions because the network is maintained with attention. It breaks down when the network is already strained, when too many calls on it arrive at once, when the wider economy is in a bad enough state that no one in the network has surplus to redistribute. At the moment, the network is functioning. Your friend will be thin this winter, but not desperate. His children will eat. His wife will manage. You will provide what you can from your own diminished position, which is less than you would have provided in a better year, but not nothing. You go home and sit with a ledger that is not a formal ledger, but a set of scratched records on a wax tablet that your wife has maintained in your absence, and you go through it together by firelight, and the numbers are what they are, which is tight but navigable, which is the condition you are trying to maintain from one season to the next, not prosperity, not improvement, navigability. The letter from the steward arrives in November. It is brief and in Latin, which means your wife reads it aloud to you because her Latin is better than yours, which has always been a mild embarrassment that you have calibrated to. The letter says the ransom negotiation for the night is proceeding, initial terms proposed, counteroffer expected in the new year, settlement anticipated by spring. It says your portion remains as agreed. It says nothing unexpected. You fold the letter and put it with the other documents in the wooden box under the bed. Documents of various ages and purposes, land records and marriage settlements and campaign contracts, and a letter from your father that arrived the year he died, and which you have not reread since. December comes with hard frost that kills what remained of the damaged wheat in the east field. The loss is now fixed. You calculate against it by eating the 2 sheep earlier than planned, which provides 2 weeks of better food and eliminates the feed cost of maintaining them, which is a reasonable trade under the circumstances. Your son kills one of the sheep himself for the first time, which he manages competently and without theater, which is appropriate to his age and his situation. You tell him he did it correctly, and he nods once and cleans the knife. The days shorten to their minimum and then begin lengthening again almost imperceptibly, and the change is not visible until you are suddenly aware one morning that the light at the end of the working day is slightly longer than it was a week before, and the change in light produces a change in mood that you have never fully explained but have relied on annually for as long as you can remember. The body's response to the year's turn, the physical acknowledgement that the worst of the season is now behind you rather than ahead. In January, a second letter arrives from the steward. This letter is not brief. The knight died. He died in the fortified town in December of the wound infection that the field surgeon warned might occur, and the red lines spreading from the wound edges that were not present when you left him, which appeared in November and were treated and appeared again and did not respond to the second treatment. He was given last rites. He was buried in the town's church. His family has been informed. The ransom negotiation has terminated. There is no money coming. You read this section of the letter twice and then fold it and put it in the wooden box. Your wife has read it with you, and she is doing arithmetic, and you know the arithmetic she is doing because you are doing the same arithmetic. The ransom would have been your principal financial improvement for this year. Without it, the current situation, already tight, does not improve in spring. It continues tight. Tighter in some respects because you will need to replace the breeding sheep that were eaten early, because the east field will need additional labor investment to improve its drainage, which is the underlying problem that made the harvest difficult. Because your companion's reduced capacity means his household will need more from you than you have available to give. You are not ruined. This is important to understand. You are not beggars, and you are not selling your land. and you are not in the condition of desperate poverty that is several rungs further down the social ladder and which involves a different and more immediate kind of suffering. You are in the condition of a man-at-arms household that absorbed a campaign's cost without a campaign's expected return, which is a setback. Which is the kind of setback that this life deals out regularly, which is the kind of setback that requires adaptation rather than despair. The adaptation is, you will take a campaign contract in spring, earlier than preferred, leaving before the spring plowing is fully done, because the contract payments begin at contract date, and you need them to begin earlier in the season than last year. This means your son will be responsible for more of the spring work, which he is now 12 and will be 13 by planting, and which you have assessed as within his capacity at a stretch. It means your wife will hire a day laborer for the most intensive periods, rather than relying on her own labor and your son's, which is a cost that the earlier campaign payment will cover. You explain this to your son at the table one evening in January. Tattoo the fire lower than you would prefer, because the woodpile is being managed carefully. You explain it to him not as a crisis, but as a plan, which is what it is, and he asks questions that are practical and intelligent, and which you answer as completely as you can. And by the end of the conversation, the plan is shared between you, and he owns a piece of it, which is necessary because he will be executing a piece of it in your absence. You check your armor in February. It has been hanging on its form since you returned, dented and pitted and needing attention that you have not given it because the attention required means spending time on something with no immediate return in a period when everything required immediate return. You take it down and work through it systematically. The dents that affect fit are addressed with hammer work, and the surface pitting is cleaned with sand and oil. The gorget you remove from the dying man on the field has been in the collection, processed through the system, and is now someone else's property somewhere in the chain of acquisition and sale. The pieces you wear are yours, old enough to be fitted to your specific body's proportions, and the maintenance of them is not vanity, but practical preparation. The sword needs sharpening. The edge has developed a slightly irregular profile from the last engagement. A nick from a blow that struck at a bad angle and which you felt at the time as a vibration in your wrist rather than an impact. You work it on the whetstone for 2 hours, by the fire, in the evening over 3 nights, testing the edge, returning to the stone, testing again. Now, your wife sits with you some of those evenings doing her own work, mending or spinning or working through the household accounts again with the methodical patience that characterizes her approach to problems she cannot solve quickly. The spring contracts come in late February. A rider from your lord's estate arrives with the terms, which are the customary terms for a man of your rank and experience, slightly adjusted upward from last year's contract to reflect the previous campaign's service, which your lord values even in a year where the financial return was disappointing. The adjustment is small, but it is acknowledgement, and acknowledgement has a practical dimension because it implies continued preference for future contracts, which is the security available to men in your position. You sign the contract. Your wife reads it before you sign it, which is also customary in your household, and she makes one observation about the provisioning clause which you raise with the rider and which is adjusted by a small amendment written in the margin and initialed by both parties. The rider leaves. You're committed to a campaign that will begin in 6 weeks. You plow the south field before you go. You and your son together, the heavy horse pulling the mold board through the April soil that is still cold enough to hold its form when turned, the furrows lying clean and dark in the pale spring light. Your companion cannot help because his leg is still stiff, though better than December, able to bear weight for moderate periods but not for the sustained labor of plowing. He comes out of his house and stands at the field edge and watches for a while and gives advice about the depth of the northeast corner where the drainage is better and the soil lighter, advice that is accurate and that you follow, and then he goes back inside because the standing gets difficult after a while. On the evening before you leave, you sit with your son and go through what needs to be done in order of priority, and he listens and asks questions, and the questions are good. He has grown several inches since last campaign. His hands are already beginning to show the specific calluses of agricultural labor, the heel of the palm and the base of the fingers, which are different calluses from the ones that military equipment produces. You leave in the morning before the village is fully awake. The horse is ready and provisioned. Your armor is strapped across the pack horse. Your wife sees you to the gate and says what she says, which is not farewell as a formal statement, but a series of practical reminders and acknowledgments that function as farewell because they are specific and affectionate in their specificity, which is her form of it and which you know by now to be entirely sufficient. The road north accepts you without comment. It is the same road you came south on 6 months ago, the same ruts in different positions as the winter has worked on them, the same villages with slightly different expressions of spring preparation, people in fields, smoke from fires that are warming workshops rather than warming against cold. The birds have returned in the hedges. The air smells of turned soil and something green that is not yet visible but is arriving. You're going back because this is what you do, not because you want to, not because the last campaign ended in a way that makes this one seem promising. Because your household survival requires campaign income and your lord requires military service, and these two requirements have aligned your life into a specific pattern, and the pattern continues regardless of how the previous iteration resolved. The field you're going to does not exist yet. It will be identified by the movement of forces and the decisions of lords and the accidents of weather and terrain and the particular miscalculations that produce engagements in this kind of war, which is not a war of decisive battles so much as a war of persistent pressure, raid and counter-raid, siege and sally, the slow grinding of contested sovereignty across a landscape that has been contested for longer than anyone currently living can remember, and will be contested for longer than anyone currently living will survive to see the end of. You know this. You have known it for several campaigns now. The illusion that a single victory settles something lasted through your first campaign and partway through your second, and then dissolved in the practical accumulation of evidence against it. What you know now is the system, not the story the system tells about itself. The story involving honor and duty and resolution. You know the economics and the seasonality and the biological reality and the accounting. You know that the field tomorrow will look like the field from 6 months ago, will smell like it, will demand the same work afterward. It will produce the same costs distributed across the same networks, absorbed, managed, continued. The road bends north. The sun is behind you. Your shadow extends ahead of you on the track, long and thin in the morning light, the shadow of a horse and rider moving north toward whatever the spring brings, which you do not know yet and cannot know yet, and have learned not to try to know in advance, because the advanced knowledge does not change the arrival of it. The track takes you over a rise, and on the other side the land opens into a wider plain, the northern plain, still showing the scraped look of fields that have been through a difficult winter and are not fully recovered, and the plain extends north, and the sky above it is the pale, indeterminate blue of early spring that contains no promise and no threat, but simply continues. As the road continues, as the season continues, as the system continues, processing men and seasons and harvests and battles into the ongoing calculation of survival that has no terminal point, and no resolution, and no ending except the ending that comes to individuals within it, which comes when it comes and not before, and which, when it comes, will be absorbed and accounted for and noted briefly and continued past. You ride.